Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. If you guys are new around here, my name is Divyanka and I'm a doctor of pharmacy here in the US. On this channel, I strive to provide both you and I resources to live our best and most productive life. Today, we have yet another episode here on the FocusRx podcast, and I am super excited to introduce my guest, Joshua Lin. Joshua works in the pharmaceutical industry within medical affairs, and in this episode, he shares such golden advice. I literally say gold so many times in the episode, but really this episode is actually filled with just so much good advice. So definitely listen to the whole thing if you guys haven't been listening to the full podcast episodes. I asked Joshua a lot about his fellowship and job experiences. And again, he has great advice to share for anyone going into a fellowship, for entry-level positions, just overall really good advice. So without further ado, let's just get right into the episode. Welcome back to the FocusRx podcast. Today, I'm very excited to have Joshua here as a guest, and we are going to be diving into topics I know the audience is excited about. So I'm just going to hand it over to Josh for him to introduce himself. And Josh, if you could start by introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about your background, and then just kind of diving straight into your career story, kind of from pharmacy school, why you even found industry interesting, and kind of your pathway through to where you are now.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast today, Divyanka. I've actually kind of watched a few of them, and I'm very excited to share anything that I can to hopefully help prospective people interested in the industry kind of find their way.
Mm-hmm.
So a little bit about myself. Born and raised in California, so California native. I knew fairly early on in my life, so now I'm like really stretching it back. But I knew fairly early on that I really liked the sciences, and health was something that had been interesting to me as I was growing up. So kind of following my required K through 12 education, I went to Pacific, University of the Pacific up in Stockton, California, where I was a pre-pharm major. I had it in my head really early on that I wanted to be someone that was very clinically minded. So even before I had gone to pharmacy school, even when I was still an undergrad, I had kind of already talked myself into doing some sort of acute care clinical background residency. So that was kind of where I had put and dedicated a lot of my time, both in undergrad and then ultimately when I was in pharmacy school as well. I think that I was kind of like that model student that a lot of pharmacy schools are trying to pivot to, which is like, let's try and sell people on residencies, let's try and sell people on clinical focus. And that was definitely where I was in my headspace at during school. Mm-hmm. What kind of changed for me actually happened right before I went on my rotations. So I kind of took an elective that technically was focused on like preparing you for residencies. But it did have like a little bit of like a fellowship aspect. So I had kind of had a little bit of thoughts in the back of my mind. When I was a student, IPHO had just started at my school. So I kind of like knew it existed, but it was kind of like behind a nebulous cloud, right? But right before rotations, we actually had a guest speaker come in from Novo Nordisk, who was a medical science liaison. And I thought that when they were talking about their job, kind of, engaging in scientific exchange with thought leaders, being the scientific backbone of the company and representing them as a field representative, I thought it was like super interesting to me. Despite, really liking patient care, really liking interacting with providers and, working with the team, there were like a couple of other things I really enjoyed throughout school as well. I really liked teaching and talking to people about data. So I used to like tutor a little bit. I used to like teach lectures a little bit. I was one of those kids that, although I didn't like preparing for it, I did actually enjoy the spirit of journal clubs, like being able to talk about new data with someone. And I knew kind of like eventually when I hit practice, that becomes like a side thing, right? Like if you're working 9 to 5 specifically on patient care, you kind of learn on your own. I'm not going to like pull out the New England Journal of Medicine and like talk to patients about it. So when I heard about that myself, I was like, wait, this is actually really interesting. And it also dawned on me like, working in pharma isn't just trying to sell something. There really is like a scientific component to a medical component to it. Mm-hmm. So ever since that kind of MSL came in and spoke to us, that's where I got my initial interest. After that, I did like research on my own. I talked to friends that I knew were already kind of planning to go down that track. Mm-hmm. And with a little bit of self-reflection, realized, hey, this is actually something I could be interested in. So I actually did like kind of like the craziest thing you can do in the rotations, which is apply for residencies and fellowships at the same time.
Oh my
Because
God.
I wasn't decided, and I was like, okay, well, I can't knock any of them out of the park quite yet. So I kind of did them simultaneously. Was very fortunate to get a fellowship offer through Rutgers University at Daiichi Sankyo for medical affairs. So after graduation and well, after a lot of contemplation, I kind of decided that that was what I wanted because based on timelines, the fellowship acceptances come way earlier than the residency interviews even happen. But I kind of talked myself into it, figured this was something I wanted to do, and went ahead and kind of committed to it. So following graduation, I got to move to New Jersey, where I did a medical affairs fellowship. It was 2 years with Daiichi Sankyo, and it was actually really cool because I was very intentional in selecting a program that made sure I got to see a lot of the different components of medical affairs. So I had been introduced to industry from medical science liaison, so I knew I was interested in that. But I also knew there were a lot of other roles, right? Medical affairs, medical info, medcom. So with the fellowship, I kind of got to see all of it. And over the course of the 2 years, I actually realized what I really enjoy doing is more medical affairs, medical strategy. So as I was coming to the close of that time at the fellowship, I knew I wanted to move back to California. Winters are, snow is fun, but not when you live in it, and 2 winters was enough for me. So I was actually very fortunate to find a job at Myovant, specifically in medical strategy. Everyone talks about how pharmacy is a small world, pharma is also a really small world. So my current manager actually used to report to my boss's boss at Daiichi.
Oh, wow.
So they were able to kind of like connect and really help kind of build a bridge there for me. So I've been at Myovant now for almost a year. I think I'm coming up on a year at the end of this month. So it's actually been very interesting, kind of like pivot, coming back to California, learning new disease state, working in a new company. That's kind of the quick overview of my journey.
Yeah, thank you so much for that overview. I think that you did a lot of interesting things along the way that I definitely want to point out. I think the first thing is you obviously applying to both residency and fellowship. And I want to kind of highlight that because not because of I'm sure that took a lot of work and I'm sure that, it was definitely the best for you. But I think that's cool from an aspect of you opening yourself up to opportunities. And again, why I'm mentioning that is because I feel like that's been a motto of mine to an extent. I don't like to, why close yourself off at the beginning, right? Like if the application says no, okay, great. That's a no from an external source. But if I'm not applying, I'm saying no to myself. So I feel like I try to do as much as possible to at least open those opportunities. So I want to just point that out again for our listeners, because I think that's interesting. Like you didn't just cross one out and you didn't say like, oh, I'm already so far down the residency pathway that I'm not going to look into the fellowships. You know what I mean? You did both. So obviously good on you for doing that. And it obviously led you to where you are. But I think that's a noteworthy point.
Exactly. And I actually love how you phrase that because that's something I try to impress on other people as well. So now I'm like cutting in here, but
No,
like
you're fine.
I'm totally on the side of like don't count yourself out. Let someone else tell you no.
Right.
I hear this a lot, especially with colleagues or people I know that have, for example, gone into community thinking that's what they wanted to do for the rest of their life. Have that direct patient contact. But after a while, I feel like they're burnt out, or if they're in a retail setting. There's a lot of retail pressure that we don't really get focus on while we're in school.
Right.
And instead of trying to pivot to something else, they kind of get in the mind of, well, this is all I know how to do, this is all I've been trained to do. I'm not comfortable expanding out or applying to other places. And I always tell them, no, like give it a shot. Everyone has to start somewhere.
Right.
Let someone else say no. Don't let yourself be the one to bring you down.
Exactly. No, I completely mimic that mindset. So love it. I think the other thing I really want to focus on, which is going to kind of go into the next question. You said that you pivoted kind of right at the end. I think a lot of times, especially when I was convincing so many friends to go down fellowship route or, look into industry. And a lot of people were like, oh, I'm in my 5th year, I'm in my 6th year. Like, it's too late. Like, I don't know anything about it. I don't have experience. And, my convincing only went so far. But I think you kind of showed that, it's possible, regardless of if you have planned this for years or not. So can you tell me a little bit more about that process? And I guess, what steps you took, what resources helped you, because as you know, there aren't many resources out there for especially industry, and honestly really understanding industry. So yeah, what resources were helpful for you? What could other people find helpful?
Yeah, so definitely for me, one of the biggest, I guess, written things I was able to get my hands on was just like the plethora of fellowship brochures. That was kind of where I started, just to gain an like understanding. So each brochure, obviously they're trying to advertise the program, but almost all of them have some sort of background on like what the department is that you're working in. You know, what are the different skills you plan to acquire, the different things you'll get involved in, and that actually gave me a really good grounding as like the different aspects of pharmacy, I mean, of the industry that pharmacists could find themselves in. So I kind of definitely use that as a jumping off point. Talking to people that I knew potentially in the industry as well. So after that, MSL came to speak to us, I actually had set up like an additional time just to call him and learn a little bit more about his role, learn a little bit about how he got there, and some of the skills that he thinks are important in order to thrive. And I think just Googling resources after those two steps was kind of what was great for me. And I think one of the things that was lacking was even just like almost like a didactic approach to learning what those different roles are. That's why I'm like so excited to be here today. And I swear Divyanka didn't like script me for this, but like I've like seen some of the videos that you have about the different functional areas, and I think those types of resources are exactly what you need, right? To start getting an appreciation and an understanding of the different opportunities that you have out there. I think those were kind of like the three key things that I was able to do in order to start getting an appreciation. I think one kind of maybe it's like a mindset shift that people have to understand as well, is that like no one is supposed to go into a fellowship being an expert in the industry. I think there's a little bit of that concern, like, oh, because I'm not familiar with it, this isn't going to be a fit for me. But a fellowship is exactly that. It's actually a training experience, a postgraduate training experience for you to become familiar with the pharmaceutical industry. So they're not looking for someone that is ready to be like a full-time employee, because you would just be a full-time employee.
Right.
They are actually designed, right, to train someone who might not be as familiar, but has the skill set, has kind of the personality and the drive to want to learn, I want to thrive. So I think that's a little bit of pressure and a little bit of perspective that sometimes people kind of put on themselves that gets a little bit lost in translation.
Yeah, I actually completely agree. And I'd extend that to entry-level roles as well. And even past possibly, a second level role, because everyone knows you're so green. And the more people I talk to, no, you're not going to cover that up. You're not going to apply for a job after a year and a half of experience and call yourself an expert, right? Like that's just, they expect that. So I feel like I more often than not only kind of internalize that, but also make sure that I say that, in an interview or when you're talking to someone, like let them know you're kind of aware that you don't know anything. And I think just grounding that and making that obvious to your audience instead of convincing them that like, look, I know all this stuff and they'll know immediately that you don't, I think is also a great point, because they realize that you're self-aware of like where you stand, but you know where you want to go. So great point there. Thank you for that insight. Since we're still on the topic of fellowships, I wanted to ask, what is a piece of advice you would share for a student preparing for, fellowship interviews? Let's just say you've gotten past the whole process and you have interviews lined up. For me, that process was, a lot of preparation. I've shared some of my materials of, the company research that I would do and things like that. But what is one or more than one piece of advice you would have for someone preparing for fellowship interviews?
Yeah, I think one of the big things to really hammer down is understanding like why you want a fellowship and being able to like convey that effectively, right? The idea is hopefully by this step you kind of understand which functional area you want to be in, whether that's commercial, R&D, regulatory, medical, and you want to be able to like speak to it effectively. You want to be able to convey why you're interested in that specific field and a little bit about why your background, even if it's not direct, is able to be applied and helpful in that specific area. So like I actually did not do any medical affairs internships or medical affairs rotations prior to my interviews. But what I could speak to was my interest in conveying clinical knowledge in a patient setting, whether it was being able to talk to a patient and explain to them a specific therapy or their disease state, or level with a doctor to help figure out what the best therapy is for them, I could really, convey the examples where I participate in kind of scientific exchange, medical exchange with people. So even though I didn't do a fellowship, I was applying for fellowship, but even though I didn't do a rotation, to do an internship, you could see how some of those applicable skills were able to translate across into the specific area I was going for. So being able to understand, why you're going into something and how what you've done prepares you for it, I think is a very, very important component of what you want to be able to convey. I think kind of whether it's like showing that you're also really excited to learn or are willing to learn is a very important component as well. So when I was interviewing for a position, when I interviewed candidates, the ones that stood the most to me were the ones that are really able to articulate like why a fellowship fits them from a learning perspective, whether it's being interested in the different rotation components of it, whether it's you kind of have a thirst for knowledge and XYZ about industry, but you're interested about ABC. Those are all very like strong examples of someone that's ready to come in, who admits that again that they might not be an expert. We don't expect you to be an expert, but they have at least some grasp of knowing what they don't know, and knowing exactly what they want to learn. I think that kind of thirst for knowledge really comes through, especially for someone trying to go into like a postgraduate training situation.
That was gold. Like if people are watching this, they better save that portion, because I think through struggle, I've learned that point. And what you really highlighted was knowing your story, right? Knowing why. And I feel like so many students kind of get caught up in, oh my God, I need an elevator pitch. Oh my God, I need to prepare for this interview. Oh my God, this. And it's like, you forget about, the story part of it. And I feel like if people were just to step back and look at like, where does this fit into my story? Or if it doesn't, how am I going to make it fit into my story? And I completely mimic you. That was the most important thing I did for myself. And when I did that, I saw the response change. When I saw how I was articulating it differently, and I saw the response from the interviewer was very different when you kind of have that story straight, right? And I think you saying, from your perspective of interviewing people for fellowships and giving that little insight was also really gold in terms of what stood out and what didn't. So hopefully people gather on that. Thank you so much for that. I'm just looking at my list of questions because we are deep in conversation, and I was like, what's the next question? Let's see. Okay, so a lot of times, we always hear that you should be interviewing the company too. But I don't think a lot of students really catch that and really know what that means. And I feel like honestly, mid-year was that place where I realized how important it is. Because as I was sitting there, through so many interviews, and everyone starts with them kind of telling you about the program, it was very evident to me which ones I genuinely did not want to be a part of and which ones I did want to be a part of. But I feel like you have to kind of come in with that mindset of actually gauging that. Otherwise it's totally going to go over your head, and you're just going to be kind of hell-bent on, did I, make a mistake? Did that interview go well, etc. What is your advice kind of around that? How do you think it's important, obviously, to assess which company you'll be working for? And moreover, what do you look for if you think it's important?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, and this is like your 10,000 foot view, any experience is better than no experience. That being said, a good experience that fits you is infinitely better than an experience where you find yourself out of place. I think one of the things that people have a hard time to believe, especially when they're kind of like on the interviewing side of the table, is that the companies are trying to find the best fit for themselves as well. So it's really deleterious to both groups if you kind of put on a facade. You try to be what the company wants to see, instead of being yourself, because what that ultimately results in is that when you're actually at the fellowship, if you got it, you either have to put on that facade continuously for another 2 years, or you end up kind of like relaxing and then realizing you and the company might not be well fit for each other. So I think besides going in with an idea of who you are, go in with an idea of what you want, right? For me, for example, I knew that I was going to be very green to industry. So I was very focused on the idea that, I don't really want a program that's at a company that's super big and therefore like silos the experiences I would get. I was very open to working at a place that would let me wear like a couple hats, explore the different areas of medical affairs and let me get hands-on in some of the different ways that things learn. I also like to ask questions about how the preceptors interact, for example, with the fellows and how the flow of work is anticipated to be. There are some people that really enjoy having someone who can kind of like guide them through something a few times first and then kind of try it on their own. And then there's others that really like hitting the ground running. They like taking a stab at something first and then getting feedback on the other end. So even something as simple as managing expectations, managing the order in which work gets done are all important things, right? To be able to understand in order to figure out if that's ultimately going to be a good place for you, because you want to be able to learn effectively, and everyone learns a little bit differently. Everyone teaches a little bit differently. So being able to really like hammer out those details if you can is really important. I think one other thing that is important, and there really isn't a good way to judge it, I think, is just like culture fit. So it is, the people that are interviewing are ultimately usually going to be the people that are going to be working with you. So you want to be able to understand if there's someone that you could find yourself at a bare minimum, like tolerating, but ideally someone that you can like, be friends with, be collaborative with, and really be a good team member with. And a lot of that can be gauged in, how they ask questions, how they respond to you, the body language, the dialogue. So being attentive to that is important as well. The worst thing you can do is be so nervous and really only focus on yourself. And at the end of the interview, being like, when asking yourself, wait, did I actually like this program? I don't even know if I wanted to go for it, and you just can't remember anymore. So really taking the time to have a breather, try and see if there's a genuine connection, see if there's a genuine match. I think are definitely key, especially when it comes to interviewing. The program's interviewing you, but you're also interviewing the program.
Yeah. No, I think I completely agree with that, which is why I asked, and I kind of want to dive deeper into that be yourself. I think that, again, we hear that a lot, but it took me a long time to figure out what that was for me. I thought I was being myself until I realized I wasn't. So I think that shift is also hard, that self-realization, because you never truly see yourself in an interview. So it's actually really hard, right, to gauge. And half of it, you're talking, you're trying to present yourself, you're nervous. And so it's very easy for being myself to kind of go out the window. Did you ever have a process, or what made you realize, or what are the things that, made sure that you were kind of yourself during interviews?
Yeah, I think one of the big, and I am not like a great person for this question, because I'm one of those people that doesn't prepare too much for things like interviews.
High five.
I want to be as genuine as I can, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things I see happen is that when you tell someone, it's important, to have a cohesive story, to have like a quick pitch, about yourself. They kind of get in the weeds of trying to like algorithm it, trying to make it, systemically check all the boxes of what all the interview guys need to say, check the boxes of kind of what the interview experts need to say, and really lose track of like what the question may essentially mean for them. I think interview prep should only go so far as to make everything sound a little bit more smooth. It shouldn't reach the point where you're providing almost like a canned response that you think is going to get you the best answer. If someone asks you, if you like are interview prepping, for example, specific question, what is your greatest strength? Don't go to Google and try to like figure out what are the best strengths to talk about. Actually, like just sit there for 10 seconds, kind of map out what you think is your best strength. Provide that answer to yourself. And then what you should do is just make sure that the answer that you provided, when you work on it, it becomes cohesive and supportable. You shouldn't actually be trying to change it to make it more palatable as much as you're trying to refine things. I think that's one kind of overstep that some people tend to do when they're prepping, trying to come up with like the best answer versus coming up with your answer and just making it like flow a little bit better.
Right.
That is like the furthest extent from a objective standpoint that I think someone should try to be able to prep themselves while still being able to like be true to the way they are, right? Be true to your responses, be true to what you want to say.
Yeah. No, that was again a golden response. And that makes me so happy to hear, the whole not prepping too much. That's actually one of the next video ideas that I have scripted and filming, because I do exactly that. I realized I mean, of course, it's a skill you have to build, and it's more of a talking and communication skill, right? More than anything. But I think once you kind of realize that, you have the things that you have in your back pocket, you have your experiences, at least be able to speak to them, and yes, of course, answer questions. But outside of that, yeah, like I think my prep has gone to absolute zero, and I do better. I feel like I do better, at least. And so I feel like that's exactly it. It comes from a genuine place. Even right now, like I have questions prepped, but you can tell that the questions that I'm thinking about, off the top of my head are just so much smoother. So if you can kind of, in the same way in an interview, like if you have it prepped, you're going to keep trying to think of that and keep trying to go to that. But instead of having that roadmap, just kind of step back and just realize that you're just having a conversation, like have that conversation.
Exactly. And I think that's key because at the end of the day, what you're really trying to build is actually spontaneity, not exactly like answer crafting, which I think is what gets into people's minds. I always like to tell people that like an interview should technically be the easiest test you'll ever take, because literally all of the answers are about you and no one knows you better than yourself. So when it comes to actually like, coming up with what you want to say, that should be the easiest part. The hardest part should really just be how to put it eloquently. And that's an entirely different skill, right?
Right.
That's not something that you do by working like an extra hour to figure out like what you would say to that question, as much as it's like becoming self-aware about your own thinking process, about your own answering and your processing abilities. And I think that is kind of like a key differentiator that a lot of people could kind of take a look at and potentially see if it helps them and their own style in an interview setting.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm kind of taking this advice for myself, but I think all of that was spot on. So we're still kind of talking about all of this. Now that you're at a place where you're a little far removed from, your time with your rotation, your fellowship, it's been a long day. What are some kind of key takeaways? And they don't have to be like, science related or pharma related at all. That you would say were your biggest takeaways from your fellowship? And that question kind of stems from, people always say you learn a lot about yourself during mid-year, and that's 100% because of interview prep, right? But even more so, and me now about to hit the 1-year mark from graduation, I've learned a lot being a young professional. And just being in the working world, but still as that green, almost student, right? I still kind of feel very, very new. And although I'm in a job, I still kind of feel like a student. So what were kind of your bigger takeaways just in general from your experience?
Yeah, I think some of the things off the top of my head, and this is, everyone will say this, but every company and every role is different. I think that's a big one. So even if it's the same job description, same title, similar therapeutic area, everyone operates and every company operates at a different level. So you can always expect that the way you work as you go to different places, as your job may change, you're going to be constantly in a state where you're learning. Because the way that you approach things, no matter where you work, is going to be absolutely different. I think that ties into like point 2, which is like the learning never stops. You can become an expert and very familiar in a specific area, but pharma's broad and you never know where you're going to go next. So I started in a very niche area. I actually started in abuse deterrent opioids, which is incredibly small. Essentially, we were making like OxyContin, but it was difficult to crush and it was painful to snort. Like that was the entire thing. And the approval process for that is totally different than like a generic, a different type of like a general drug that requires like 2 phase 3 trials. This is kind of like the requirements for a generic, like going generic, except it was still changed because technically it was a formulation differentiation. So like you could see it was like a very unique experience. After that, I went to oncology, where all of my drugs happened to be breakthrough designation, accelerated approval. So suddenly I went from having like generic, very unique trials to having like, oh, stuff's getting approved on phase 2 trials. And we got like moved really quick, and that's rapid. And now I work in women's health, where I'm back to drugs that actually require the full gamut of NDA review. We have to do like 2 replicate phase 3 trials. And I'm like, man, I didn't even see a phase 3 trial in my other roles. So like everything's different. Everything's constantly different. And it's important to be able to like be adaptable and be able to be engaged in that. I think another thing that strikes me is that like the people matter and your manager matters. Depending on who you ask, there's going to be very different schools of thought. when you're looking for a new job, there's kind of like two mentalities. One that says, it's okay to join a company. I guess let me pin this out. There's like two scenarios that people like to pit against each other. There's like company A, where you're not a big fan or a believer of the product, but you really like the team and the manager. And you've got like company B, where the science and the product are very, very strong. The company is very strong, but your team and your manager might not be as great. Depending on who you ask, you have very different responses on what you should pursue. For the purpose of this discussion, my personal understanding, my personal learning is that it is the people that matter. I would always choose A, because even if the therapeutic area I'm going into might not be the one that I love the most, the drug might not be the best, there's always more I can learn. And I can learn most from people that are willing to develop me, from people that are willing to grow me. But I think that ultimately is going to be what drives me to keep moving on and accelerating in my career. I think there's this idea that some people have where, if you join a company because of a person and that person leaves, then you're stranded. And to some extent, that's a little bit true. But on the flip side, if you join a company because of a drug and you just can't work well with the people you're working with, then I feel like you're kind of starting at square zero regardless. To me, I think people matter. I think that was one thing that really comes out to me. And you don't necessarily need to do a fellowship to learn that. But you continue to see it more and more. As you get further in your career, as you contemplate like what next steps are, the people you work with and how they represent you continually have an impact on you in your life.
I completely agree. And like you said, I think that I learned that more and more. My first internship was at Celgene, and I am still in touch with my manager only because he was just that great, right? And he doesn't have a PharmD. He still is in industry, but it was just a different background. But he coached me, and he still coaches me, versus other bosses that I've had who haven't done that. And it's very evident that there's a stark difference. And now, having worked, like I mentioned, for a few months at least, I would 100% agree with you. I think that, at the beginning, you can kind of talk to science in the same way, if you were to move on, you can still speak to your work, you can still speak to the science, even if it, let's just say, goes south for the company, you still have experience. But like you mentioned, you have to work with all those people. And so if you can't get past that, the work isn't going to get done very easily. And in a very efficient way, or in a way that you like, it's not going to happen. So completely agree on the people part. I wanted to ask and kind of finish this conversation with kind of your transition from fellowship to where you are now. I know, of course, the job searching process after fellowships is not easy. It's just like finding another job. So what was your process through that? I know you mentioned you had some connections, but I assume you were looking at other positions too. So what was that process like? Again, what kind of resources helped? Did you go for the job boards only? Were you mainly using networking? Kind of what were your approaches?
Yes, I definitely didn't hesitate to tap into all of the resources that I had. This kind of goes back to one of an earlier question about being honest, but one of the things that was really important for me, and some people would think it's kind of like career suicide, was when during my interviews for fellowship, they often ask you what do you want to do in 5 years? And a lot of people like to say that, I want to be XYZ role, I want to stay with the company, because to some extent, people that have fellowships are interested in retention.
Right.
I was actually very clear to them, I'm from California, definitely down to move to New Jersey for a couple of years, but ultimately my interest is to have some sort of medical role back in California. And to some companies, that's kind of like a red flag. But at Daiichi, they kind of were they contemplated, and they came to the conclusion that, if Josh stays for 2 years, maybe he can get an MSL position in California, maybe he leaves. But at the end of the day, that 2 years is good for us. I mentioned this because when you hit the job searching phase, depending on how honest you were with your preceptors, changes how much you can rely on them as a resource. I have plenty of kind of friends or co-fellows that kind of went into the company saying, oh, I'm definitely going to stay. And at the end of the 2 years, they kind of realized they wanted to try something new, and they just had to do it on the down low. They couldn't really tap into their existing network because as far as their preceptors knew, they were going to stay. So that greatly limited their mobility, right? For me, when I had kind of revisited the topic, I want to move back to California, everyone was immediately on board and trying to find opportunities for me. If they knew someone in California, if they were like connected to someone at a job I was looking at, they would reach out and they would kind of like connect with them. So I think that allowed me to like leverage my internal network from the fellowship to definitely help me look at those opportunities. In terms of online resources, I personally use LinkedIn. That was probably the easiest one for me. I probably still have it. So I still look, once in a while just so I know what's out there. But I have like these filters set up that specifically try to look for roles within kind of my scope and the area I wanted to do, which was medical strategy, medical affairs. Sometimes a little bit MSL depending on like the therapeutic area, but I primarily use LinkedIn to help connect with those opportunities. Most of the time, I would like sometimes search Google or some other job boards as well, but LinkedIn was pretty good at capturing most of them. So that was the one that I tended to rely on. And then one of the things that is often like I think misconstrued is that pharma recruiters are also a very good resource as well. So there's a lot of good third-party recruiters out there that are obviously trying to fill positions, and they're very seasoned at what they do for the most part. They kind of know what is a good candidate and what's a good fit, and they're a very good resource to help you get connected potentially with opportunities out there. I think there's this myth out there that if you do a third-party recruiter, that they like get a cut of your salary and you get paid less. That's not actually true. So for most companies, recruiters, are comp based based on positions that they fill, but the amount that they make on that comp can oftentimes actually be correlated to how much you ultimately get hired for. So it's actually to their benefit to help you do as well as they can as well. So in many ways, it's nice having someone almost in your corner. I personally, in the California region, especially in clinical development, there's a group called Meet Recruitment that's really good. So I've referred a lot of like my friends there, and they've been able to use them to find MSL roles, to find clinical development roles, and they personally are very good at connecting people and worked with fellows in the past. But that's an example, right, where there's kind of this stigma depending on who you ask regarding recruiters, but for the most part, they have your best interest in mind because it happens to align with theirs. So I would say, I utilize like the trifecta. I use my own network, I use the recruiters network, and I also kind of just did some searching on my
own. Those are all great resources. I think, to your first point about you being able to utilize your internal network, and like you said, going back to being honest, I think that's a really good point. And that's just one place where you kind of mentioned where it'll kind of catch you. I think that same thing about being yourself and being honest, like, our wants can change and our needs can change, and that's totally fine. Everyone's, does. But exactly like you said, if you kind of pigeon yourself into that anyway to begin with, you kind of did yourself a disservice. So, I mean, I think that can go in so many ways, but that's a great example. Mimic you on the LinkedIn. I think LinkedIn has stepped up its game so much. And I've seen the change to the point where I know that many companies solely recruit on LinkedIn. The role that I'm in right now was only recruited on LinkedIn. And so I think it's, if not already, the biggest kind of job source resource. And of course they have LinkedIn Learning now and all of that stuff. So definitely great there. And I have actually talked to the Meet recruiters as well. And I agree with you in terms of having someone in your court. I think it's actually kind of nice to talk to recruiters, even if you don't end up like, working with them or finding a role, because especially with recruiters, it's so time-based and kind of need-based. And I know they like to fill, immediately. But exactly like you said, they're a great resource. They know, they can tell you immediately, like, you're not going to get that role. You're going to get this role. You're not going to get that role based on kind of your background. And they're very good reads at that. So kind of mimic everything you said. I think that's, these are things that people don't usually share. So I definitely appreciate it. And I know, and I hope that listeners do too. Just for the last bit of this, I want to open the floor to you. Your advice and anything you've said has been honestly incredibly honest, like you said. And I think that a lot of people don't share that. And, at least what I say in my videos, I have been thinking for a while, and I didn't come up with it. I have heard it from somewhere. I've heard it from, so-and-so manager or this person or that position. And I think that the biggest thing there is like actually finding that knowledge. And so I think that you're a great resource. If it's okay with you, could I share your LinkedIn so other people can reach out to you as well for any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually really enjoy talking to people that are kind of like trying to get their head started into things. That's actually one of the reasons I was so intrigued in this channel because I'm like, wow, now we've got like some static resources that people can look at and kind of like
Hmm.
point to. But definitely enjoy being able to connect with people and hopefully kind of shed a little bit of light into their alternatives, right? I think if we had to have like one big takeaway kind of like from this entire talk, it all stems back to, it's don't be afraid to pivot. Don't pigeonhole yourself. It's never too late to explore other options and leverage your experiences to try
Hmm.
and see if you're a good candidate and really able to thrive in that setting.
Yeah. No, I think your advice and insight is super helpful. I hope people watch this because, like I said, gold maybe 5 times in the whole thing. Like it is, and this is the kind of advice that people either shy away from giving or don't know that they can give, and half of it is asking the right questions. But thank you so much for your time. Do you have anything else to kind of share, or advice, last parting moments?
I think the big thing is that so I know FocusRx is obviously focused on primarily people pharmacy backgrounds and people looking to go into the pharmaceutical industry. But like harkening back to something you had mentioned earlier as well, is that like even beyond the pharmaceutical industry, you don't have to be afraid to look beyond, right? I have friends that have graduated from pharmacy school that have gone into finance, that have opened their own business, that do web development, game development. So regardless of what your passion is, definitely take the chance on yourself, right? Like you should be your best advocate. Don't be the one that says no. But
Yeah.
other than that, I hope I was able to be helpful to people out there.
Definitely. And if anything, Josh, you helped me. So I do appreciate it. And I want to just mimic that last thing you said. I think you're completely right, like you have been. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. You'll see this live on the channel. And thank you for everyone who's listening. Zoop, that's a wrap on today's episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. As I said in the beginning, this episode is really filled with a lot of really good information. So save this link if you guys want to come back to this later. Definitely make sure you utilize kind of all the advice that Joshua had to give. As always, I hope this episode was helpful for you guys. I hope you guys learned something. And as Joshua mentioned, you can always reach out to him on LinkedIn if you have any other questions. That is it for me today, and you guys will, of course, see me in the next one.